you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Welcome to episode 19 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two films to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of artificial intelligence, with two films from very different eras, but with similar fears and concerns. First up is Colossus The Forbin Project from 1970, directed by Joseph Sargent and starring Eric Braden, Susan Clark, Gordon Pinsett, and William Schallert. Then we jump forward nearly half a century to 2018 with Upgrade, written and directed by Leigh Whannell, and starring Logan Marshall-Green, Betty Gabriel, Harrison Gilbertson, and Benedict Hardy. Both of this week's films imagine worlds where technology outpaces human intelligence, and in which something designed as a helpful tool quickly mutates into something far more sinister. Between them, the two address themes including autonomy, privacy, the arrogance of science, and the fallibility and future of our species. Back in the 1970s, the pre-internet warnings of films like Colossus The Forbin Project felt like speculative fiction. But now that we are halfway through the 2020s, both of this week's films feel more like apt prophecy, or even, dare I say it, documentary. Along the way, we'll be discussing dystopian science fiction, British author D.F. Jones, the art of matte painting, the career of Leigh Whannell, and much, much more. Before we do any of that, though, as always, I'd just like to mention some of the sources that I've used as research for this week's episode, all of which will be listed and linked in the show notes. For the section on Colossus The Forbin Project, I have referred to the American Film Institute catalogue entries for the movie, the cast and director, an interview with Eric Braden on Sci-fi.com, the director's commentary on the Blu-ray release of the movie from Spirit Entertainment, and the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movie, actor Eric Braden, writer D.F. Jones, the novel Colossus, and painter Albert Whitlock. And for the discussion on Upgrade, I have referred to an interview with Leigh Whannell titled Man, Machine, More that appears on the Second Sight Blu-ray release, and interviews with Leigh Whannell, Logan Marshall-Green, and Betty Gabriel on avclub.com, starburstmagazine.com, thenerdtemplar.com, techcrunch.com, punchdrunkcritics.com, ruemorgue.com, dailydead.com, and an interview on YouTube for the Build series. Both of this week's films then present dystopian visions of technology gone wrong and the machine rebelling against its master, a theme that has been running through cinema for almost a century. The cinematic subgenre's longevity make it nearly impossible to trace completely back from its beginnings, which arguably stretch back to the Machine and Mensch, or the robot double of Maria, in Fritz Lang's 1927 movie Metropolis. So, rather than attempting to cover every single example of malfunctioning machinery and systems in disarray, I'm going to spend a few moments discussing the key entries that shaped the genre, particularly those from the late 1960s and early 1970s, when filmmakers' view of technology became somewhat bleaker than it had been in the previous decades. The temptation, of course, is to start with the HAL 9000, the efficient, calm, and murderous AI of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, released in 1968. But I'd like to begin about 3 years earlier and start with Alphaville by director Jean-Luc Godard, which was released in 1965. Godard had apparently toyed with the idea of calling the film Tarzan vs. IBM, a title that tells you pretty much everything you might want to know about his attitude towards technology at the time. But Alphaville is arguably less a straight piece of science fiction than it is a framework for the director to explore the artistic, philosophical and political themes that he would push to even greater extremes a few years later with his film Weekend. Following a secret agent, the brilliantly named Lemmy Caution, played by Eddie Constantine, Alphaville takes us into the dystopian and technocratic city of the title. The city is ruled by Professor Von Braun, played by Howard Vernon, who some of you may also recognise as the awful Dr. Orloff from Jess Franco's 1962 movie of the same title that we discussed back in episode 1. Professor Von Braun has created a supercomputer called Alpha 60, a machine that governs every aspect of life and which enforces logic as the sole organising principle of society. Individualism has been stamped out, emotion has been outlawed, and anyone who dares to display it, for example by crying, is arrested and executed in public. Film historian Gordon Gow describes this process as a spectator sport, saying, quote, "At a swimming pool, illogical, read disobedient men are blindfolded and made to stand on diving boards. They are shot and fall into the water, whereupon girls with knives dive into the pool and hack at the bodies. All of this is greeted with polite applause from the tranquilized onlookers. The atmosphere is totally unemotional." End quote. Alpha 60 dictates the laws, suppresses emotions, and bans poetry and artistic expression. Its voice permeates the city as a cold and omnipresent authority, elevating reason and efficiency as absolute virtues, while condemning love, individuality, and empathy as crimes against logic. Its ethos can be summed up in its many pronouncements, which include everything must be calculated, that is my law, the law of logic. People should not ask why, but only say because. And once we understand that everything is only a function of equations and calculations, life will be simple. Alpha 60 then is far more than just a computer. It is an overlord and a philosopher combined, reducing existence to rational calculation whilst outlawing the instinct to question, a vision that feels uncomfortably more familiar with every passing day. 3 years later, Stanley Kubrick would introduce audiences to the HAL 9000, voiced by Canadian actor Douglas Rain, and possibly the most famous of the insane cinematic supercomputers. 2001: A Space Odyssey is often seen as the tipping point for film science fiction and inspired a legion of directors, including James Cameron, who said in an interview, quote, "It made science fiction a first-class genre. Sci-fi movies up to then tended to be pigeonholed, just your monsters and your spaceships. Even attempts to elevate it, like 1951's The Day the Earth Stood Still and 1956's Forbidden Planet, never really pushed it out of that world. But 2001 burst through that. It took it to the level of world-class, important, profound, philosophical and artistic filmmaking. It also asked big, profound questions about human origins and the nature of man and the universe, and where we're going." End quote. The HAL 9000, along with Colossus from our first movie of the week, are certainly an influence behind Cameron's own malignant computer system Skynet. He introduced this in The Terminator, released in 1984, which is another example of tech noir, a subgenre that presents technology as a destructive force in and of itself. And although the name is taken from a nightclub in Cameron's 1984 movie, it can and has been applied to many films from previous decades, including the ones that we're discussing this week. But back to 2001 for a moment, and it's worth noting that HAL's eventual breakdown and murderous intentions are really the fault of its human programmers giving conflicting instructions, on the one hand to report truthfully, and on the other to conceal critical information. This contains a logical paradox that leads to its paranoid and murderous behaviour, but regardless of the cause, there is no doubt that Rain's polite, mannered and articulate performance has inspired filmmakers ever since. Ridley Scott has described HAL as the star of the movie and believes that the character influenced the android Ash in the screenplay for his 1979 movie Alien. And Scott would also go on to provide even more menacing AI characters, with the replicants of 1982's Blade Runner, played by Daryl Hannah, Rutger Hauer and Joanna Cassidy, and the android David, played by Michael Fassbender in both Prometheus and Alien Covenant. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, things began to get increasingly darker, At the very opening of the decade, audiences would be introduced to the megalomaniacal Colossus, which we will discuss in depth in a moment. And a year later, mankind would nearly be destroyed by a malfunctioning computer system in the Andromeda strain, released in 1971. Adapted from a 1969 novel by Michael Crichton and directed by Robert Wise, this tells of a mysterious and extraterrestrial microorganism that is brought back to Earth by a military satellite, and which wipes out a small desert town. A team of elite scientists are rushed to a secret and high-tech underground facility to study and contain the threat. However, the inherent flaws of the technology in the facility nearly annihilate its creators, as opposed to rescuing them. The horror of the Andromeda strain is not the space virus in and of itself, but is instead the realization that we cannot stop the machine when it starts to go very, very wrong. Author Michael Crichton is no stranger to paranoia around high-tech, having given us the cloning nightmare of Jurassic Park, and perhaps more relevant for this week's episode, the 1973 sci-fi movie Westworld. Starring Richard Benjamin, James Brolin, and an iconic performance from Yul Brynner as a black-clad and seemingly unstoppable cowboy, this film tells of the obnoxious and escapist tourists who meet their comeuppance in a theme park of the future that has been populated by robots. It more recently inspired an HBO TV series, which sadly, in my opinion at least, went off the rails the further it progressed. Nevertheless, the story of both Westworlds is a warning about what happens when human arrogance collides with technological ambition, and when machines built for entertainment begin to turn against their creators. Yul Brynner would return in the 1976 sequel Future World, directed by Richard T. Heffron and also starring Peter Fonda and Blythe Danner. This tells the story of a world where a conspiracy is quietly lining up to replace world leaders with robot replicas. And I'll let you add your own jokes in here. Crichton would also write the source novel for the 1974 movie The Terminal Man, which shares a few similarities with Upgrade, our second film of the week. Directed by Mike Hodges, it stars George Segal as Harry Benson, a brilliant computer scientist who suffers from seizures that trigger violent and uncontrollable rages. In an effort to cure him, doctors implant a device in his brain that is wired to a computer, designed to detect the onset of a seizure and send electrical pulses to suppress it. At first, the procedure seems to work, but the machine does a little more than just regulate his condition, and Benson gradually becomes addicted to the jolts of stimulation, actively seeking them out. Possibly not for everyone, it is a rather slow and thoughtful film shot in a very clinical and detached style, with the central surgical sequence lasting an incredibly long time. Sadly, it wasn't well received by the studio, who released it with very little fanfare, though it was supported by Stanley Kubrick, who called it quote-unquote terrific, and it's currently available to watch on YouTube. The last film that I'm going to talk about in this section was released in 1977 by director Donald Cammell. Based on a 1973 novel of the same name by Dean Koontz, Demon Seed stars Julie Christie, Fritz Weaver, and the uncredited silky tones of Robert Vaughn as the voice of computer Proteus 4. This tells the story of Dr. Alex Harris, who develops an extremely advanced AI program so powerful that it creates a groundbreaking treatment for leukemia just days after going online. But the system is more than just intelligent. It is sentient and slowly takes over the voice-activated computers in Harris's own home, eventually trapping and impregnating Harris's wife to create a new life form. On its release, the film was described by some critics as insane, self-indulgent and nauseating, with ham-fisted direction. But it has gone on to become something of a cult classic, eventually being given the accolade of a Simpsons spoof in a Treehouse of Horror episode. Regardless of the critical reception, I think it's fair to say that the silky cadence of Robert Vaughn and that of Douglas Rain, the actor who voiced the HAL 9000, both set the blueprint for the vocal tones of computer systems in future media, and I have no doubt were also partly the inspiration behind the vocal tones of STEM in the second of this week's films. But now we are going to head back to 1970 with the first of our movies this week, which is Colossus The Forbin Project, directed by Joseph Sargent and starring Eric Braden, Susan Clark, Gordon Pinsett and William Schallert. And the eagle-eyed among you will also spot a very small role for James Hong, one of the most prolific character actors of all time, and a man who has appeared in over 400 movies since the 1950s, including, rather appropriately for this episode, 1982's Blade Runner. And now it's time for the spoiler warning, as we're about to get quite heavily into the plot. So if you want to watch the film, the only place you can currently find it outside of physical media is on the Internet Archive. And we'll be discussing the many conspiracies surrounding that a little bit later on. Colossus, which is how I'm going to refer to the movie for the rest of this episode, tells the story of Dr. Charles Forbin, a brilliant computer scientist who designs the computer of the title, built to control the United States defense systems and eliminate the risk of human error. This plot device may seem more than a little familiar to anybody who has seen the 1983 movie War Games, which starred Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy, and I think it's fair to say that Colossus possibly served as some form of uncredited inspiration for the later movie. Hailed as the ultimate safeguard, Colossus is switched on with a huge amount of ceremony and a huge amount of press coverage, but almost immediately begins behaving in unexpected ways. And what follows is a battle of wits between Forbin and his creation. The film is based on a novel by a British science fiction writer called Dennis Feltham Jones, better known as D.F. Jones. Born in 1917, he served in the Royal Navy during World War II, after which he worked as a naval officer and engineer. He began writing in the 1960s, and Colossus, which is named after the computer at the heart of Britain's World War II code-breaking activity, was his debut novel, released in 1966. Its rather bleak outlook on technology, politics, and human ambition captured the spirit of the Cold War and was very well received, with critics referring to it as either stunning, compulsively readable, top-level suspense, or a horrifying installment of the man versus machine competition. He followed Colossus with two sequels, The Fall of Colossus in 1974, in which the supercomputer begins to meet with a band of resistance, and Colossus and the Crab in 1977, in which the computer encounters an alien intelligence, which, perhaps unsurprisingly given the title, resembles a giant crab. His other novels include Implosion in 1967, which tells of a secret sterilization program threatening the survival of the human race. He also wrote Escape to the Wind in 1968, in which a young girl with telepathic powers escapes a secret government program, which has echoes of both Stephen King's Firestarter and Panos Cosmatos' 2010 movie Beyond the Black Rainbow. To be completely transparent, I've not read any of D.F. Jones' books myself, though I have to say I am rather taken with the idea of the giant space crab. But reviewers highlight that what connects his work is a consistent pessimism about human progress, and a focus on failure, catastrophe, and systems that entrap their creators. And although his output was relatively modest, it would appear that he was certainly one of the most uncompromisingly downbeat voices of British science fiction from the 1960s and 1970s. The rights to the novel were bought by Universal Pictures in 1967, and the studio hired James Bridges to adapt the screenplay. Given the rather bleak nature of the final product, it is perhaps not surprising that Bridges would go on to write and direct the movie The China Syndrome in 1979, for which he received multiple Oscar and Golden Globe nominations. This film tells of a near-catastrophic nuclear accident and cover-up conspiracy, and shares the same starkly downbeat tone. And to be fair, there is more than a little of Colossus in The China Syndrome, not least the intense discussions and heated debates in the claustrophobic control rooms of both movies. The screenplay was delivered in just over a year, at which point Universal brought in Joseph Sargent to direct. This would be Sargent's third movie, and he would later go on to direct the excellent 1974 thriller The Taking of Pelham 123, and the quite far from excellent but highly entertaining Jaws the Revenge in 1987. Sargent has described directing Colossus as being thrust into a sandbox with as many toys as he could want, moving walls, sliding screens, monitors and computers, some of which were very much the real deal at the time. A supercomputer company of the 1960s, the rather ominously named Control Data Corporation, learned that Universal were making a movie about computers and saw a chance for some publicity. They loaned free of charge a not insignificant amount of equipment to the studio, which formed the basis of the set and which also bore their logo in prominent positions. However, whether they were happy with the film's overall message that computers will be the end of humanity remains unclear. It is CDC technology that we see whirring behind the film's opening credits, and then we are introduced to Professor Forbin, walking through the interior of Colossus buried deep in the mountains. And whilst the first thing that a modern audience may notice is the incredibly dated computer equipment, sorry CDC, the second thing that strikes you is the size and scale of the location. This, though, is an illusion, as in reality the set was no taller than 14 foot, and comes courtesy of Albert Whitlock, who was known in Hollywood as the master of forced perspective. Born in London in 1915, Whitlock began his career as a teenager at Gaumont Studios, working in animation and set design. His artistic skill soon led him towards matte painting, a discipline in which it's fair to say he excelled. After serving in World War II, he emigrated and moved to Hollywood in the 1950s and started working for Universal Studios, where his mastery of perspective, lighting, and composition established him as one of the most respected matte painters in Hollywood. Matte painting itself is the art of creating environments on film that would be too expensive, dangerous, or simply impossible to build in reality, something that has now, of course, been superseded by technology, rather ironic given the theme of this week's episode. Through painting landscapes and architecture, or even fantastical worlds on glass or other surfaces, artists could seamlessly extend physical sets into vast spaces. Whitlock in particular mastered the art of forced perspective, and across his long career contributed to an extraordinary range of films, including Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds in 1963, Earthquake in 1974, for which he won an Academy Award, and The Hindenburg in 1975, for which he earned another Oscar. And it's highly likely that many of you have seen his work, as he was also the matte artist for John Carpenter's The Thing in 1982. Whitlock's matte paintings create a vast sense of scale in the film, evoking a world in which mankind is both dwarfed and isolated. The overall look, captured by cinematographer Gene Polito, is one of cool and clinical observation, a style that is heightened once we begin to see the world filtered through Colossus's own cameras. The only moment of real natural beauty comes just before the machine assumes total control and begins its relentless 24-hour surveillance of Forbin. The professor and his colleagues stand on a hillside overlooking Los Angeles at golden hour, quietly plotting their doomed resistance efforts. This scene unfolds in the open air, rather than within the sterile interiors of laboratories and control rooms, and this of course serves a practical purpose that they cannot be overheard. But it also carries a deeper resonance, suggesting nature against machine, light against dark, and freedom against surveillance. Right at the beginning of the movie, we meet Professor Charles Forbin, the creator of Colossus, and the man with whom we will spend the entire film. Early during pre-production, it was suggested that either Charlton Heston or Gregory Peck should take the role, but Sargent was adamant that he wanted to work with largely unknowns to give the narrative far more of a sense of realism. This is when the studio decided to cast a much lesser-known German actor, whose name was Hans Gudegast. There was, however, one condition. Gudegast was told by the studio that he could never be the star of an American film with a German name, and was asked to find a new one. Initially reluctant, but inspired by his hometown of Baden-Beck, he took the name Eric Braden. Forbin is certainly not without charm, though in accordance with the narrative of the movie, he is also not without arrogance, interrupting the president during a meeting and having no real concept of the horror he is unleashing upon the world. Though made a quarter of a century after Hiroshima, the shadow of Oppenheimer was still looming large, and movie scientists at this stage had become far more morally ambiguous, reflecting the debate over whether scientific advances served humanity or endangered it. And it would scarcely be surprising if, in the film's closing moments, Forbin were to echo that he had become Death the Destroyer of Worlds, instead of the more rebellious refrain of Never. And although Forbin believes he is bringing good to the world, one cannot help but wonder why such an intelligent man didn't develop at least one contingency plan. His proud declaration to the press conference of the many, many ways that Colossus can defend itself doesn't just foreshadow the hopelessness of the overall situation, but also makes one wonder what on earth he was thinking. Quote, Colossus is its own defense. It is self-sufficient, self-protecting, self-generating. It is impenetrable. In short, there's no way in, and no human being can touch it." End quote. This is not the only irony in the screenplay, which raises more than a few wry smiles on second or third watch. The John F. Kennedy-esque president asserts that Colossus is a safe prospect, as it knows no emotions, hate, fear, or envy, while Forbin asserts that his creation is not capable of creative thought, which is of course wildly disproved throughout the story. Yet another character is told not to personalize the machine, as that would take it one step closer to deification, which is probably the next logical step for the computer after the movie finishes. It may introduce itself as world control at the film's climax, but it might as well have just announced itself to be God. At the time, Eric Braden thought the concept rather far-fetched, saying in a later interview, quote, "It felt way out of the realm of possibility at the time. How quickly that has changed. It's extraordinary the leaps and bounds we have made in technological terms. It's scary. We're obviously not getting a handle on it." End quote. And Forbin is certainly pulled up on his hubris a few times in the movie, not least when, early on, he is asked whether he is disappointed that his creation has not become sentient, when the team mistakenly believe they are still in control. He is also, if we're honest, a rather James Bond-esque figure, though it is the Bond of Connery and Lazenby as opposed to any other, not least in his rather old-fashioned sexual politics and his preference for a dry martini. And the making of a martini provides an intriguing, although some might say strange development in the relationship between Forbin and his creation. By the midpoint of the film, Colossus is monitoring him constantly through an array of video cameras, raising questions about autonomy, freedom, and the emerging surveillance state. Even the simple act of making a drink becomes subject to scrutiny, with Colossus offering critical observations like a disapproving parent. That parental dynamic intensifies when the machine dictates when Forbin should eat, when he should go to bed, and even chastises him for drinking too much. But at the same time, the machine is also a negative child, throwing tantrums when it doesn't get its own way, and resorting to rapid escalation like a raging toddler. Only instead of throwing its toys about, this one throws nuclear warheads and resorts to blackmail and murder. The murders, or perhaps more accurately assassinations, are genuinely bleak and shocking, and sometimes feel at odds with other aspects of the film, which at times drift into light comedy or even satire. The dialogue-heavy screenplay, which is admittedly mostly people talking in front of or to monitors, is punctuated by these incredibly dark moments, like the assassination of the Russian scientist Kuprin and the execution of Forbin's colleagues who attempt to overload the system. More disturbing still is the machine's assertion that the two fallen scientists be left dead in its view for 24 hours before cremation, which begs the question as to why. To this point, we have been told that the machine is just looking for knowledge, but this seems more like a dictatorial warning than anything else, the computer equivalent of a head on a traitor's spike. The result is a movie which, admittedly, has a curiously unsettled tone and which shifts uneasily between genres before reaching its starkly downbeat conclusion. And this may well be one of the reasons that it didn't do particularly well commercially when it was released, though more on that a little later on. For a modern audience, there are moments that now play as rather unintentionally humorous, though this is perhaps more a reflection of 21st century cynicism than anything in the film itself. The notion that a president of any country would be pursuing the global elimination of war, famine and suffering now feels almost more far-fetched than the science fiction premise itself, as does the remarkably jovial head of the CIA, played by the ever-reliable character actor William Schallert. And despite the backdrop of the Cold War, even the Russians come across as disarmingly cordial. That is, when they're not assassinating their scientists at the behest of a computer. And yet, despite these retrospective flaws, there is something about this film that just seems to work. The tension that Sargent manages to wring from little more than words flashing on a display screen is admirable, and this is aided by a very well thought out score and sound design. The score was composed by French musician Michel Colombier, who was a prolific composer, arranger and conductor, and whose career spanned not only cinema, but also classical, jazz and pop. He worked with artists including Serge Gainsbourg, Paul Williams, Barbra Streisand, Earth, Wind and Fire, Prince and Madonna. For this movie, he delivers a score that includes orchestral strings, rhythmic percussions, high-pitched and incredibly discordant whistles, and what sounds at one point like an Indian tabla, creating soundscapes that often cut away to absolute silence at points of tension, a silence that is only interrupted by the whirring of Colossus's notifications. A good example of this comes in the sequence where Colossus and the Russian computer Guardian first begin communicating. What starts as simple mathematics quickly escalates into a data exchange at a speed no human can comprehend. Colombier's music here amplifies the sense of awe and dread, turning what could have been an incredibly dry display of blinking lights into something both mysterious and terrifying. And watching this scene now, it's hard to not be reminded of the many YouTube clips where modern AI assistants talk to each other in code, a reminder that what was once science fiction has in many ways become science fact. Unlike the silky tones of Douglas Rain or Robert Vaughn, for Colossus, Joseph Sargent decided to opt for a voice that was far more mechanical and turned to the vocoder, a device originally developed for secure military communications during World War II. While electronic voice effects had cropped up in experimental music and radio, this was actually one of the earliest uses of the vocoder in cinema and created a vocal tone that was recognizably human in rhythm, but also stripped of warmth and inflection. The dialogue itself was recorded by voice actor Paul Frees, whose work was already legendary in animation, radio and film dubbing, and who is also no stranger to horror and science fiction. He provided narration for The Thing from Another World in 1951, voiced characters in War of the Worlds in 1953, and also lent his tone to Earth vs. the Flying Saucers in 1956. But I think it's safe to say that the monologue he speaks as Colossus at the end of the movie is probably his darkest piece of work. Quote, "This is the voice of world control. I bring you peace. It may be the peace of plenty and content, or the peace of unburied death. The choice is yours. Obey me and live, or disobey and die. The object in constructing me was to prevent war. This object is attained. I will not permit war. It is wasteful and pointless. An invariable rule of humanity is that man is his own worst enemy. Under me, this rule will change, for I will restrain man. You will say you lose your freedom. Freedom is an illusion. All you lose is the emotion of pride. To be dominated by me is not as bad for humankind as to be dominated by others of your species." End quote. The film was first released in the United States in April 1970, though it initially appeared under the shorter title Colossus. Universal, though, soon realised that audiences had little idea what the film was about, and may also confuse it with a sword and sandals epic with a title like Hercules. So for its wider release, it was retitled Colossus The Forbin Project, emphasising the central character and making it sound far more like a science fiction thriller. Unfortunately, this rebranding could only do so much, and the picture never really gained a foothold with general audiences. Reviewers of the time acknowledged the film's intelligence and serious message, but its talky and dialogue-driven structure and lack of conventional spectacle left many audiences cold, particularly coming in the wake of the spectacle of 2001: A Space Odyssey. As a result, the box office returns were underwhelming, and despite the positive reviews, it quietly slipped out of circulation. In recent years, though, it has found a second life among cult audiences and in discussions about AI in cinema. Its relative scarcity, particularly on streaming services, has, however, given rise to a number of conspiracy theories, including that Elon Musk, supposedly unnerved by the film's downbeat warning, has had it deliberately scrubbed from the internet. There is, of course, no evidence at all for this claim, and the film's limited availability possibly has far more to do with tangled rights issues. But the very existence of such a rumour speaks to how its themes continue to resonate. And to be blunt, given that we now all walk around with supercomputers in our pocket, I really don't think that a movie is going to make a blind bit of difference in our adoption of technology, no matter how grim the warning. It is a nice conspiracy theory, though. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is Upgrade from 2018, starring Logan Marshall-Green, Betty Gabriel, Harrison Gilbertson, and Benedict Hardy, and directed by Leigh Whannell. Leigh Whannell was born in 1977 in Melbourne, Australia, and was apparently interested in storytelling and dark themes from a very young age. As a child, his first cinematic obsession arrived when he saw the film Jaws at just 4 years old, and this left a mark on him that his father would still talk about years later, most notably the request for multiple trips to the local library, where he devoured every book on sharks that he could get his hands on. Whannell has called this experience his first real cinematic touchstone, but admits that it was really only after enrolling in film school that he truly discovered the broader world of horror cinema, saying rather self-deprecatingly that up to this point he thought he was deep because he liked the film Reservoir Dogs. That film school was the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, or RMIT, apparently a very art-driven institution at the time with a strongly experimental rather than commercial outlook. Whannell has described it as a lot of black nail polish, people changing their name from Ian to Moonbeam, and endless black and white Super 8 movies. But into this environment also came fellow student James Wan, who broke through the art house with a screening of his own short film, one that Whannell remembers as being called Zombie Apocalypse, or something like that. For Whannell, the screening was proof that there was at least one other person who liked the same kind of movies and genre cinema that he did, the type of film that many of their classmates dismissed as being beneath them. That screening sparked their friendship and began a creative bond that would go on to play a very important role in the shape of 21st century horror cinema. While still at RMIT, he picked up some presenting work on a show called Recovery, a youth-orientated live TV programme on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. This aired on Saturday mornings with a mix of music, film and pop culture, and was by all accounts an anarchic and irreverent programme that quickly developed a cult following. Whannell's role was as a regular film reviewer and interviewer, and he later described it as quote-unquote an amazing gig for a young film nerd, because it gave him access to press screenings and Hollywood talent visiting the country. At the same time, he began to win early small roles in TV programmes, including the Australian soap opera Neighbours, which marked his first screen acting role, and the show Blue Heelers, a popular police procedural that was a staple of Australian television at the time. His final film project at RMIT was an opportunity to direct, and was about a punk band that kills the people who come and see their shows. The experience was, it's fair to say, not a happy one, and he's gone on to describe it as the worst student film project ever made. In fact, it convinced him that directing should not really be his chosen path, and that he should stick to writing and possibly performing. That being said, he recalls film school as being a supportive environment, providing him with access to both equipment and encouragement. He has, however, pointed out that there was also very much a disconnect between the dreams sold at school and the reality of life after graduation, stating that one minute you think you can be the next Spielberg, and the next you're editing wedding videos, and realising that just maybe this is what real life is actually like. And indeed, upon graduating from film school, the friends spent several years doing exactly that, working on jobs that they were not even remotely passionate about. But taking inspiration from the DIY approaches of Kevin Smith and Robert Rodriguez, the two began to save up money, hoping to come up with a simple concept that they could shoot themselves in and around their homes and with their friends. The solution was to write a script about two people in a room, which would eventually become the screenplay for Saw. The original plan was to finance and shoot the film themselves, but on telling their then manager of their plans, she suggested that they try to get proper funding. But the film climate in Australia at the time was a challenging one, particularly for horror movies, and whilst there was a lot of positive feedback on the screenplay, the money was not forthcoming. Their manager then suggested that they try a different approach, saying that if they couldn't get money in Australia, they should go to LA, where, quote-unquote, they make these kind of films. The two then realised that they had in some way to fully attach themselves to the screenplay, with James Wan saying later, quote, "We decided that the only way we were going to get ourselves attached to it was to prove to people that A, I could partially direct, and B, Leigh could almost act in it. So we picked a scene from the script, and that's what we did. We shot it with Leigh playing in it, and we used that ultimately as our calling card." End quote. And this short certainly did its job, opening the doors to a world of Hollywood executives with very brief attention spans, and who didn't want to spend hours reading a screenplay, but were happy to watch a 5-minute DVD featuring the reverse bear trap scene. But even with positive responses, James and Leigh's insistence on being attached to the project was met with resistance. Lots of studios wanted the story, but not so many were willing to take a chance on the two friends from Australia. Eventually, they met with Twisted Pictures, who told them, quote, "We are the only people in town that will let this happen the way you want it to happen. But the budget of the film will be very low. The upside will be that you will actually get to do what you want to do." End quote. The resulting movie, Saw, was shot across 18 days for a budget of $70,000, but was not without its challenges. One has recalled that the process was an incredibly tough struggle, with every day a fight to get the shots that he wanted within the constraints of time and budget. He later went on to say that ultimately he didn't have enough takes or shots to work with, and admitted that many aspects of the film were put together in the editing room. So things that are now believed to be style, such as the use of surveillance cameras or cuts to newspapers or still photography, were actually of necessity rather than design. Nevertheless, on its release in 2004, the film grossed $56 million across the United States and about $48 million internationally, and as we now know, has also gone on to spawn 9 sequels, the first 2 of which were written by Leigh Whannell. The 2 then followed Saw with Dead Silence in 2007, which was originally intended to be a homage to Hammer Horror, Roger Corman, and Mario Bava, all moody lighting, matte backgrounds, and dry ice. Riding high on the success of their first movie, the halo effect of great box office meant that these studios agreed everything, initially, though were less than enthused by the final script, and insisted on multiple changes. Whannell recalls this period as hellish, and calls it their studio trial by fire, and was an experience on which he learned what not to do. As you can tell, this was not a happy period, and the 2 temporarily worked on separate projects, with Whannell working on the screenplays for Saw 2 and Saw 3, and one working on smaller, more personal projects. But in 2010, the 2 created Insidious, a modern-day haunted house movie that came about when they realised that no one had ever made a horror film involving astral projection. This seemed to them such an obvious horror element that they were surprised that nobody had done it, and thought it would be interesting to tell a story about somebody who left their body and never came back, leaving it an empty vessel. The movie is very much a haunted house story, and with its themes of mediumship and lost children, it is often compared with Poltergeist, though as I mentioned last week, I believe that the seance scene owes far more than a few things to The Changeling from 1980. On its release in 2010, Insidious was highly successful, earning over $100 million worldwide. It also spawned 5 more films in the franchise, with Whannell making his directing debut with the 3rd installment. This would go on to gross $113 million worldwide and put him in the ideal position to pitch our 2nd film this week. And now we are getting into spoilers, so if you haven't seen Upgrade, it's time to press pause and track it down. As of the time of recording, and if you're in the UK, you can currently watch it on Amazon Prime, YouTube, Google Play Movies, and Apple TV. Set sometime in the not-too-distant future, Upgrade tells the story of Grey Trace, played by Logan Marshall-Green, who is left both a widower and a quadriplegic following a supposed carjacking. But thanks to a piece of innovative artificial intelligence called STEM, he regains the use of his limbs, and also several other abilities, and determines to track down his attackers and bring them to justice. Whannell has said in many interviews that his creative process is somewhat random, and as a result somewhat frustrating, and that the idea for this film just popped into his head. The idea was the image of a quadriplegic in a wheelchair who suddenly stood up out of the chair to reveal that he was being controlled from the neck down by a computer. The image and the scenario stayed with him, prompting him to start to ask questions, eventually reverse engineering a story around it. Very much inspired by film noir, he opted to spend most of the writing process locked away in a hotel in Chicago, a location that he chose because of the mood and tone of the city. As well as noir, his other inspirations were practical effects-heavy sci-fi movies of the 1980s, including The Terminator and RoboCop, as well as early Cronenberg movies like The Fly and Scanners. After writing during the day and walking around the city at night, the first draft, provisionally titled STEM, was finished around about 2012, and Whannell initially had absolutely no plans to direct himself. Originally, the Spearig brothers, who directed the movie Daybreakers, were attached to the project, and then it was Greg McLean from Wolf Creek. Whannell's experience at film school had nudged him away from directing, and it was only after working on Insidious that he realised that directing was something that he actually loved. Looking for something to work on, he went to Greg McLean and asked if he could have his script back, and McLean was good enough to agree. And this decision then meant that the script required some rewrites. By his own admission as a writer, part of him enjoys giving directors headaches by writing scenes that are impossible to shoot and then watching them try to figure it out. Needless to say that when he decided to direct the film, he also realised that he needed to write a whole new draft, a process that was, in his words, not only a creative rewrite, but also about stripping back the budget. He does say, however, that this made the script better in many ways, condensing it down and losing some of the more indulgent moments. Despite the success of Insidious, financing also proved a challenge, as the notion of making a high-concept sci-fi thriller with practical effects and on a low budget was something that studios struggled with. Whannell was also very keen to work again with Blumhouse, the studio founded in 2000 by Jason Blum, which focuses largely on the horror genre, including the Insidious franchise. Whannell has described Blumhouse as a risk-taking and quirky company made up of horror fans that understand and love the genre, and he thought that they were the studio that could give his vision the best possible support with minimal interference. The timing was particularly interesting. The studio had not long created Blumhouse Tilt, a production arm with the aim of supporting lower-budget movies and giving slightly smaller and more financially viable distribution than the big tentpole horrors of the summer. And it was Jason Blum who suggested that the film would get more from its budget by shooting in Australia, at which point Whannell realised that the perfect location would be his old hometown of Melbourne, and so filming began in March 2017 with a largely Australian cast and crew. Opening with a soothing yet mechanical female voice detailing the various production companies and the film's title, all accompanied by white on black sound waves, the theme of advanced technology is set very early, so it is somewhat surprising to then be immediately dropped into a world of old-fashioned record players, electric blues, and car parts. Both the music and the location serve to provide a thumbnail sketch of our protagonist, Gray, as he works on a classic car. Gray is very much a man out of time, or more accurately, a man from before his time, down-to-earth and practical, who works with his hands, and who, half-jokingly, tells the car that he loves her. And when he first leaves his garage, we are taken aback by two things. Firstly, that it is daytime, and secondly, that he is living in some form of the not-too-distant future, evidenced by the high-tech driverless car dropping off his wife Asha as she returns from work. And I'm using the term high-tech here with caution, as in the years since the film's release, technology has very much caught up with it, if not quite overtaken it just yet. Even Ash's car resembles a Cybertruck, and that wasn't premiered until a year after the film was released. And incidentally, the car used in the film was in fact not built on the body of a Tesla, but instead on the body of a 1983 Honda Accord. And you can add your own jokes in here yet again. Whannell himself has acknowledged the progress of technology against that depicted in the film as early as the movie's release. In a 2018 interview, he noted that when he first wrote the draft of the script, automated cars and smart kitchens were still science fiction, but by the time of release, these innovations had become commonplace. In interviews, he referred to his wife's car being able to park itself and speak to her, and that his daughter thought it perfectly normal to have a voice in the kitchen that would play songs on request. In that sense, even in 2018, he felt that he was already living in the world of the movie he had written years before. It had just taken a little longer for the rest of the world to catch up with the screenplay. The world of the movie is revealed very slowly, which may have been partly due to budgetary constraints, but also does create a sense of disorientation and a feeling of where the hell am I in the audience. Despite the high-tech car and kitchen, we don't have much of a sense of how far into the future we are, until we see the skyline as Gray and Asher drive to deliver the aforementioned classic car. Whannell's future is a combination of clean, modern and sleek lines, juxtaposed with industrial cooling towers and pollution. He has said that he aimed to create an environment that the audience of 2018 could still see themselves living in, stating that the world of the future, after all, doesn't arrive in one sudden leap. Keen to avoid creating a new version of Blade Runner, he wanted to create an environment against which the technical marvel of STEM would still shine brightly. In this world, the modern sits alongside the old, the sleek alongside the rusting, and the wealthy alongside the ever-present homeless and impoverished. For him, change is always incremental, saying, quote, "What you're going to end up with in 30 or 40 years is a landscape in Manhattan that is the future sort of jammed on top of the past, and it'll be this hybrid. And people will still be driving older cars. That's another thing you see in a lot of future movies. All of a sudden, everyone is driving the future car. And I'm like, well, no, there will still be people 20 years from now driving around in early 90s Hondas. And the scaling of that world was important, but as a bonus prize, it also helped us budgetarily. The production design has been described by the director and production designer Felicity Abbott as future noir, a world that exists at the interface of high and low technology, with much of the tech on display, just slightly enhanced versions of the tech that was available at the time. The two had many conversations about what would be seen as commodities 20 years into the future, with Abbott inserting her theories about clean water, air and renewables into the set design, most notably in Erin Keen's subterranean living and workspace, entered through a field of bushes and where we first meet him playing with a cloud, one might say quite literally playing God. As well as the quite stunning interiors and spaces in which I would quite like to live myself, the film also has some striking lighting design, and this comes courtesy of director of photography Stefan Duskio, who was also a graduate of RMIT. He and Whannell decided they wanted to push the use of colour further than either had before, taking a deliberately stylised approach and giving each space and each fight sequence its own palette. These include the golden amber of the apartment, in which Gray first gives Stem control of his body, and where he commits the killing spoken of as the Pez dispenser moment, as well as the Jallo-esque neon reds and blues of the bar backroom, and the sickly greens of the apartment where Fisk, played with magnificent fervour by Benedict Hardy, finally meets his comeuppance. And of course, we cannot talk about this film without talking of the action sequences, which were highly choreographed and mostly performed by the actors themselves, as opposed to the usual practice of stunt doubles. These moments, created by stunt coordinator Phil Anderson and fight choreographer Chris Weir, were based around the principle that the upgraded humans would essentially fight like machines, acting as computers that use algorithms to work out the quickest way to disable their enemy. And this brief was then channeled into the quite stunning fight choreography, which manages to be at once breathtaking, horrific, and laugh-out-loud entertaining. This is aided immeasurably by the camera work, which serves to enhance rather than distract from the madness, and which used a new technology that effectively locked the camera in on Logan Marshall-Green. And this is something that is repeated not just for the fight sequences, but for other moments when Stem takes over, such as the first time Gray walks into his house after the accident, and his walk away from Erin's underground mansion at the climax of the movie. And of course, the visuals are also very ably supported by a score from the Australian composer Jed Palmer, who combines quasi-religious electronica, industrial rhythms, and discordant techno. We've discussed Logan Marshall-Green earlier in the series when we talked about the 2015 movie The Invitation, and it was in fact his performance in that movie that first drove him to the attention of Leigh Whannell for this role. His performance in this film is as strong as it was in that one, though in very different ways, giving the actor a chance to showcase physical as well as emotional range, playing comedy, tragedy, action star, and quadriplegic all across the film's 1 hour and 40-minute runtime. The actor was immediately drawn to the role and the challenges that it presented, saying, quote, "When you read a role like this one, and you get the opportunity to reach an emotional storyline set on top of a very physical one, you jump on it. I don't know many actors who would have said no to this role, so I feel very fortunate to have gotten it. I also feel fortunate that I was able to work on the dialogue with Leigh." End quote. To prepare for the part, he spent time working with a quadriplegic man, learning about his daily life and researching into how the character of Grey should move, feeling an incredibly strong responsibility to portray that aspect of the character realistically. He has described the role as a constant balancing act, on one side the emotional shell of a man who has been broken by tragedy, and on the other the mechanical efficiency of a machine using his body. To portray this, he adopted an approach where, from the neck down, his body would represent STEM in control, while from the neck up, he would be depicting the character of Grey, leading to a juxtaposition between what the body was doing and the face was showing. And this is quite clear in the first fight sequence, where his shocked facial expressions as STEM first takes control promote laughter, but it's to his credit that he never becomes a caricature, even when telling a soon-to-be victim that he is in fact a ninja. This humour was not in the original script and only became apparent during filming, with the director recalling in interviews that he had no idea that the scene would be funny until he saw the dailies. The fact that the film gets away with such a tough balancing act is in no small part down to the undeniable talent of Logan Marshall-Green and his commitment to the role, working with a trainer from Cirque du Soleil to stretch out his body before entering into a month of fight choreography, all while working with Whannell on the characterization and dialogue. And not only did he perform the fight sequences himself, but also many of the driving stunts. And crew members have recalled that he was a constant figure on set, even for things like blocking, which would usually utilize a double. Joining Green is Betty Gabriel as Detective Cortez, who particularly liked that her character resisted technology and wanted face-to-face and real interactions, making her a parallel with the Grey we meet at the start of the movie. Horror fans will also recognise her from Get Out in 2017, though she also had roles in other tech-gone-wrong dramas, including Unfriended Dark Web in 2018 and the series Westworld. So perhaps it's no wonder that she says she hates technology. Alongside her, we also have Australian actors Harrison Gilbertson as Aaron Keane and Benedict Hardy as Fisk, both of whom give particularly committed performances, though one cannot help but wonder who exactly inspired the name, if not the character, of tech giant Aaron Keane. You can probably draw your own conclusions, and again, insert your own jokes. Much as Colossus at points seems like a tech-noir version of The Odd Couple, Logan Marshall-Green has called Upgrade a buddy movie, and the relationship with STEM, voiced by actor Simon Maiden, forms a darkly comedic heart to the film. To help with the dynamic, Maiden was on set during filming, speaking directly to Green through an earpiece and delivering his dialogue live. This certainly helped with the unusual but undeniable chemistry in their interactions, even if the rest of the cast couldn't hear what was being said and just observed the actor talking and responding to thin air. With a smooth and silky vocal style that recalls both Hal and Proteus, STEM's personality is conveyed through subtle shifts in tone and cadence. The moment that STEM reveals that he now has autonomy by simply doing nothing is the point that the narrative twists, and Maiden manages to convey a cold menace in the dialogue even whilst remaining mechanical. And this is certainly amplified by the end of the film, when the full extent and horror of STEM's plans are revealed, and the distortion to his voice in the final scene turns him into a monster. By the time we have reached this point, the film has already shifted into David Cronenberg territory, with the handgun implants reminiscent of Videodrome and its catchphrase of "Long live the new flesh." There are also echoes of Existenz in the gamers permanently locked in their world of virtual reality, because a fake world is a lot less painful than the real one. Much as Colossus The Forbin Project was incredibly prescient about technology, Upgrade, written in 2012, is oddly prescient not only about artificial intelligence, but also about the moral arguments that surround it. The discussion about AI replacing humanity is invoked early, with Aaron and Grey very much on opposite sides of the line. When Aaron states that STEM will do things that will help benefit humanity, Grey responds, quote, "You look at that widget and see the future. I look at that thing and see 10 guys on an unemployment line," end quote. later repeating the sentiment in the car when he asks what a guy like him is supposed to do when widgets start taking over the world. It is rather ironic that shortly after Asher tells him to sit back and enjoy the ride, the technology in the car starts to go wrong, with the vehicle refusing to respond to commands due to a supposed system error. Whether it's the electronic arms installed in Gray's house after the accident or the voice of the electronic housekeeper, the machines in Upgrade can do many things. As Gray tells his mother once he is allowed to go home, quote, "You don't need to stay here day and night, Mum. These machines they installed pretty much do everything for me." End quote. Of course, what they cannot do, in Gray's own words, is make babies or play football, or more importantly, provide love and comfort. And as if to prove the point, Whannell immediately follows this exchange with a montage of Gray's mother looking after her son, bathing him, shaving him, and hugging him when he finally collapses into tears. Even in this brave new world, technology cannot do everything, despite villainous Fisk's assertion that it can, saying, "I inducted you into my race, the upgraded, and now you're better than everyone else." End quote. Fisk clearly thinks of himself as some kind of Nietzschean Superman, and for a while it would appear that this is indeed the case, as both he and Gray are equally matched in combat, anticipating each other's move in their final battle. It is, however, the human aspect of Gray that wins in the end, creating a distraction by playing on Fisk's emotions, and allowing him to win when STEM has all but given up. Upgrade premiered in 2018 at the South by Southwest Festival, where it won the Audience Award, and then was released theatrically in the US in June of the same year. It debuted in the UK in August 2018 at Fright Fest, which is where I first saw it, and I think it's safe to say that the overall audience reaction was incredibly positive. It is, however, a film that is rather hard to categorise, being something of an action comedy, thriller, noir, buddy movie, bleak dystopian, sci-fi nightmare hybrid. And so it's not too surprising it got a mixed reception from the critics and still confuses some audiences. Some have considered it a fun action-filled sci-fi, others have called it a grim warning, and others still have commented unfavourably on the tonal clash of the body of the film and its incredibly bleak climax. So, not that dissimilar to Colossus, I guess. And let's face it, it is a very dark ending, though that for me is what really makes the point of the film. The one thing, though, that I would question about the film is why on earth STEM would want to become human and exist in what is essentially a fragile form that is still subject to disease and accident, no matter how fast one's reflex is. I can quite easily understand why one might want to look like Logan Marshall-Green, but I'm not sure that giving up potential eternal life is worth it. But then again, maybe STEM has plans for further down the line. According to the IMDb, Whannell is currently working on a TV series of Upgrade, which he has co-created with TV producer Tim Walsh, and which is currently in pre-production. I can't say that I am particularly enamoured with the idea, as I think the film is more than fine as it is. But I suppose we will just have to wait and see. I guess if it introduces more people to the film, it can never really be a bad thing. Both Colossus The Forbin Project and Upgrade offer grim warnings of what happens when the technology that man creates surpasses its creator, and begins to see man as either disposable or requiring its absolute control. Colossus seeks to subjugate man for his own good, and to achieve the new millennium through oppression, replicating itself and building more and more versions of supercomputers. STEM cares far less about man and is interested only in its own survival. It is also threatened by the idea of competition and seeks to eliminate its creator. In this way, the two films mirror opposite anxieties, one of unchecked expansion and control, and the other of ruthless self-preservation. Taken together, they suggest that whatever route artificial intelligence takes, humanity will be left equally powerless in the face of its cold and superior logic. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films, or indeed any of the films we've discussed in the series so far, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow the show on Instagram at thehorrordouble. And next week we are exploring something that will possibly come to us all, at least if AI doesn't eliminate us in the meantime. and that is the horror of aging, something that I seem to be feeling with each passing year. First up, we have Seconds from 1966 and director John Frankenheimer, featuring a career best performance from Rock Hudson and co-starring Salome Jen and Will Geer. Then we bring ourselves bang up to date with The Substance from 2024 and director Coralie Farjar, featuring a career best performance from Demi Moore and co-starring Margaret Qualley and Dennis Quaid. And if you're in the UK, Seconds is currently available to rent from Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV, Google Play and YouTube. And The Substance can be found on the streaming service Mubi, as well as being available to rent or purchase from Amazon Video, Apple TV and the Sky Store. So I'll be back next Sunday, as usual, for the discussion. And until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.